Greetings! Welcome to Sanderson Storytime number 3, where I'm going to be revealing the title of Secret Project number 3 and doing a reading for you. This one is going to be a little extra long. We'll probably be here for an hour and change would be my guess, maybe even a little longer, more like an hour and a half. Because this is actually my favorite of the 3 secret projects. I happen to love them all. They are, all products of my imagination, of which I am very fond. But this one kind of has a special place in my heart, and I'm going to do a little extra long reading on this. Like before, I will come back at the end, or I'll stick around at the end, to talk a little bit about my inspirations and where this came from. But regardless, we're going to go right into it. This is in the Cosmere. The title is Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. The star was particularly bright that night when the Nightmare Painter started his rounds. The star, singular, no, not a sun, just one star, a bullet hole in the midnight sky, bleeding pale light. The Nightmare Painter lingered outside his apartment building, locking gaze with the star. It always felt friendly to him. Many nights, it was his only companion, unless you counted the nightmares. After losing his staring match, he turned down the street, which was silent save for the faint hum of the Hyone lines. Ever present, they flowed through the air, twin bands of pure energy, thick as a person's wrist, about 20 feet above the street. One light was an indecisive blue-green. You might have called it aqua, but if so, it was an electric variety. Or teal, perhaps. Turquoise's pale cousin, who stayed in listening to music and never got enough sun. The other was a vibrant fuchsia. If you could describe a personality to a simple line of light, this was perky, boisterous, blatant. It was a color you only wore if you wanted every eye in the room to judge you. A titch too purple for hot pink, it was, at the very least, a comfortably lukewarm pink. The residents of the city of Kilahito might have found my explanation unnecessary. Why put such effort into describing something everyone knew? It would be like describing the sun would be to you. Yet, you need this context, for, cold and warm, the Hyone lines were the colors of the city. Needing no pole or wire to hold them aloft, they ran down every street, reflecting in every window, lighting every denizen. Wire-thin strings of each color split off to each structure, powering modern life. They were the arteries and veins of Kilahito. And, just as necessary, albeit in a different way, was the young man walking beneath them. He'd originally been named Nakaro by his parents, but by tradition, many nightmare painters went by their title to anyone but their fellows. Few internalized it as he had, so we shall call him as he called himself, simply Painter. You'd probably say Painter looked Vaden. Similar features, same black hair, paler skin than your average Alethi. He'd have been confused to hear that comparison, as he'd never heard of such lands as those. In fact, his people had only just begun to think about whether or not their planet was alone in the Cosmere. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Painter. He was a young man, still a year from his 20s, as you'd count the years. His people used different numbers, but for ease, let's call him 19. Lanky, dressed in an untucked buttoning gray-blue shirt and a knee-length coat, he was the type who wore his hair long enough to brush his shoulders because he thought it took less effort. In reality, it took far more, but only if you do it right. He also thought it looked more impressive, but again, only if you do it right, which he didn't. You might have thought him young to bear the burden of protecting an entire city, but you see, he did it along with the hundreds of other nightmare painters. And this, he was important in the brilliantly modern way that teachers, firefighters, and nurses are important. Essential jobs that earn fancy days of appreciation on the calendar, words of praise in every politician's mouth, and murmurs of thanks from people at restaurants. Indeed, discussions of the intense value of these professions crowd out other, more mundane conversations, like ones regarding salary increases. Painter didn't make much as a result, just enough to eat and have some pocket cash. He lived in a single-room apartment provided by his work. Each night, he went out on his task. And he did so, even at this hour, without fear of mugging or attack. Kilahito was a safe city, nightmares excluded. Nothing like rampaging semi-sentient voids of darkness to drive down the crime. Understandably, most people stayed inside at night. Night. Well, we'll call it that. The time when people slept. They didn't have the same view of these things that you do, as his people lived in persistent darkness. Still, during his shift, you'd say it felt like night. Painter passed through hollow streets alongside overstuffed apartments. The only activity he spotted was from Rabble Way, a street you might charitably call a low-end merchant quarter. The long, narrow street lay near the perimeter of town, naturally. Along it, the Heon connections had been bent and curved into signs. These hung out from shop after shop like hands waving for attention. Each sign, letters, pictures, and designs was created using only two colors, aqua and magenta. Art drawn in two continuous lines. Yes, they had other sources of light. Light bulbs, as common on many planets. Kilihuto often used them indoors, but the Heon just worked. No need for machinery or replacement, so many relied on it, particularly outdoors. Soon, Painter reached the edge of the city. The end of Heon. One final street wrapped around Kilihuto, and beyond that was the Shroud, an endless inky darkness that besieged the city and everyone on the planet. It smothered the city like a dome, driven back by the Heon, which could also be used to make passages and corridors between cities. Only the light of the star shone through the Shroud. To this day, I'm not 100% certain why. But we are close to where Virtuosity splintered herself, and I suspect that has had an effect. At the perimeter of the city, just in front of the Shroud, Painter folded his arms, confident. This was his realm. Here he was the lone hunter, the solitary wanderer, the man who prowled the endless dark, unafraid of... Laughter tinkled in the air to his right. He sighed, glancing to where two other nightmare painters strolled the perimeter. Akane wore a bright green skirt and buttoning white blouse, and carried the long brush of a nightmare painter like a baton. Tojin loped beside her, a young man with bulging arms and flat features. Painter had always thought Tojin looked incomplete, as if the shards had taken an unfinished person and rounded up. They laughed again at something Akane said. Then they saw him standing there. "Nikaro?" Akane asked. "You on the same schedule as us again?" "Yeah," Painter said. "It's, on the chart, I think." Had he actually filled it out this time? "Great," she replied. "See you later, maybe?" Yeah," Painter said. Akane walked off, heels striking stone, paintbrush in hand, canvas under her arm. Tojin gave Painter a little shrug, then followed, his own supplies and his large painter's bag. Painter lingered as he watched them go, and fought down the urge to go chasing after. He was a lone hunter, a solitary wanderer, an unescorted meanderer. Regardless, he didn't want to work in a pair or a group like a lot of the others did. It would be nice if someone asked him, so he could show Akane and Tojin that he had friends too. He would reject any such offer with stoic firmness, of course, because he worked by himself. A single saunterer. Painter sighed. It was difficult to maintain a properly brooding air after an encounter with Akane, particularly as her laughter echoed from 2 streets over. Being a nightmare painter might not have been as solemn a job as he made it out to be. It helped him to think that it was, made it feel like less of a mistake, particularly during those times when he went to bed and regretted the decisions that had forced him into a life where he'd spend the next 6 decades on this street every night, backlit by the Heon, alone. Chapter 2. Yumi had always considered the appearance of the day star to be encouraging, an omen of fortune, a sign that the primal Hijo would be open and welcoming to her. In fact, the day star seemed extra bright today, glowing a soft blue on the eastern horizon as the sun rose in the west. A powerful sign, if you believed in such things. There's an old joke that notes that lost items tend to be in the last place one looks. By converse, omens tend to appear in the first place people look for them. Yumi did believe in omens. She had to, as though she rarely spent time thinking about them these days, an omen had been the single most important event in her life, the one that had appeared right after her birth, the one that had marked her as chosen by the spirits. She settled herself on the warm floor of the wagon as her attendants, Chae-young and Hwanji, entered. They bowed in ritual postures, then fed her with mapon sticks and spoons, a meal of rice and stew that had been left on the ground to cook. Yumi sat and swallowed, never so crass as to try to feed herself. This was a ritual, and she was an expert in those. Though she couldn't help feeling distracted. Today was 19 days past her 19th birthday. A day for decisions. A day for action. A day, maybe, to ask for what she wanted. It was 100 days until the big festival in Torio City, the grand capital, seat of the Queen. The yearly reveal of the country's greatest art, plays, and projects. She had never gone. Perhaps this time. First, she had duties. Once her attendants finished feeding her, she rose. They opened the door for her, then hopped out of the private wagon. Yumi took a deep breath, then followed, stepping into the sunlight and down into her clogs. Immediately, her two attendants leapt to hold up enormous fronds to obscure her from view. Naturally, the people in the village had gathered to see her, the chosen, the Yokihijo, the girl of commanding primal spirits. Not the most pithy of titles, but it works better in their language. This land, Torio, couldn't have been more different from where Painter lived. Not a single glowing line, cold or warm, streaked the sky. No apartment buildings, no pavement. Oh, but they had sunlight. A dominant red-orange sun, the color of baked clay. Bigger and closer than your sun, it had distinct spots of varied color on it, like a boiling breakfast stew churning and undulating in the sky. This crimson sun painted the landscape, well, just ordinary colors. That's how the brain works. Once you've been there a few hours, you wouldn't notice the light was a shade redder. But when you first arrive, it does look striking. Like the result of a bloody massacre, which everyone is too numb to acknowledge. It also provides dynamic descriptions for poets telling stories, so there's that. Hidden behind her fronds, Yumi walked on clogged feet through the village to the local cold spring. Once at the spring, her attendant slipped her out of her nightgown. A Yokihijo did not dress or undress herself, and let her walk down into the slightly cool water, shivering at its shocking kiss. A short time later, Chae-young and Hwanji followed with a floating plate holding crystalline soaps. They rubbed her with the first, then she washed. Once with the second, then she washed. Twice with the third. 3 times with the fourth. 5 times with the fifth. 8 times with the sixth. 13 times with the seventh. You might think that extreme. If so, have you perhaps never heard of religion? Yumi's particular flavor of devotion, fortunately, did have some practical accommodations. The later soaps were only such in the broadest definition. You would consider them perfumed creams with a deliberately moisturizing component. I find them particularly nice on the feet, though I'll probably need them for more parts of my body once I arrive in the Torish version of hell for abusing their ritual components for bunion relief. Yumi's final rinse involved ducking underneath the water for a count of 144. Underneath, her dark hair flowed around her, writhing in the current of her motion as if alive. The forced washing got her hair extremely clean, which was important, as her religious calling forbade her from ever cutting it, so it reached all the way down to her waist. Though it wasn't required of the ritual, Yumi liked to look up through the shimmering warm water and see if she could find the sun. Fire and water, liquid and light. She burst out of the water at the exact count of 144 and gasped. That was supposed to get easier, she had been told. She was supposed to rise, serene, renewed, and reborn. Instead, she was forced to break decorum today by coughing a little. And yes, she saw coughing as breaking decorum. Don't even ask how she regarded calling someone by their first name. Ritual bathing done, it was time for the ritual dressing, also done by her attendants. The traditional sash just under the bust, then the larger white wrap across the chest, loose undergarment leggings, then the tobok in 2 layers of thick, colorful cloth with a wide bell skirt, bright magenta for the ritual day of the week. She slipped on the clogs again, then somehow stepped in them, natural and fluid. I consider myself a reasonably adroit person, but Torish clogs, they call them geituk, always felt like bricks tied to my feet. They aren't necessarily hard to balance in, they're only 6 inches tall, but they grant most outsiders the graceful poise of a drunk chol. With all of that, she was finally ready for her next ritual. In this case, she needed to pray at the village shrine to seek blessings of the spirits. So, she again let her attendants block sight with their fronds, then walked out around the village to the flower garden. Here, vibrant blue blossoms, cup-like to catch the rain, floated on thermals. They hovered around 2 feet off the ground. In Toria, plants never dared touch the ground, lest the heat wither them away. Each flower had wide leaves at the sides, catching the air, like lilies, with fine dangling roots that absorbed the nutrients from the air. Yumi's passing caused them to swirl and bump against one another. The shrine was a small structure, wood, mostly open to the air, but with a latticed dome. Remarkably, it also floated gracefully a few feet off the ground, this time by way of a lifting spirit underneath. It took the shape of 2 statues with grotesque features facing one another, One vaguely male, the other vaguely female. Separate parts, though they come from the same spirit. One crouched on the ground while one clung to the bottom of the shrine. Yumi approached among the flowers, the soft thermals causing her skirt to ripple. The thick cloth didn't rise enough to be embarrassing, just enough to give shape and flair to the bell of her costume. She again took off her clogs as she reached the shrine, then she stepped up onto the cool wood. It barely wobbled, held firm by the strength of the spirit. She knelt, then began the first of 13 ritual prayers. Now, if you think this description of her preparations took a while, that's intentional. It might help you understand, in the slightest way, what it was to live Yumi's life. Because this wasn't a special day in terms of her duties. This was normal. Ritual eating, ritual bathing, ritual dressing, ritual prayers, and more. Yumi was one of the chosen, picked at birth by Omen, granted the ability to influence the Hijo, the spirits. It was an enormous honor among her people, and they never let her forget it. The prayers and following meditations took around an hour. When she finished, she looked toward the rising sun, slots in the shrine's wooden canopy decorating her in alternating lines of light and shadow. She felt lucky. Yes, she was certain that was the proper emotion. She was blessed to hold this station, one of the fortunate few. Duties done for the moment, she relaxed, though she thought she probably shouldn't have, and she contemplated the world the spirits had provided. The warm sun of vibrant red-orange, shining through brilliant clouds, yellow, crimson, violet. A field of hovering flowers, trembling as tiny lizards leapt from one to the other. The stone underneath, warm and vibrant, the source of all life, heat, and growth. She was part of this, a vital one. Surely this was wonderful. Surely this was all she should ever need. Surely she couldn't want more, even if today was lucky, even if, perhaps for once, she could ask. The festival, she thought. One day to visit, wearing the clothing of an ordinary person. One day to be normal. Rustling cloth and the sound of wooden shoes on stone caused Yumi to turn. Only one person would dare approach her during her meditation. Liyun, a tall woman in a severe black tobok with a white bow. Liyun was her kihomaban, a word that meant, in their language, something between a guardian and a sponsor. We'll use the term warden for simplicity. Liyun stopped a few steps from the shrine, hands behind her back. Ostensibly, she waited upon Yumi's pleasure, a servant to the girl of commanding primal spirits. Trust me, the term grows on you. And yet, there was a certain demanding air to even the way Liyun stood. Perhaps it was the fashionable shoes, clogs with thick wood beneath the toes, but long heels behind, with a sleek feel. Perhaps it was the way she wore her hair, cut short in the back, longer in the front, evoking the shape of a blade at each side of her head. This wasn't a woman whose time you could dare to waste. Yumi quickly rose. "Is it time, Warden Nimi?" she said with enormous respect. Now, Yumi and Painter's languages share a common root, and in both there's a certain affectation I find it hard to express in your tongue. They could conjugate sentences, or add modifiers to words, to indicate praise or derision. No curses or swears existed among them, interestingly. They would simply change a word to its lowest form instead. I'll do my best to indicate for you this nuance by adding the word highly or lowly in certain key locations. "The time has not yet quite arrived, Chosen," Liyun said. "We should wait for the Steamwell's eruption." Of course. The air was renewed at the Steamwell's eruption, so better wait a few minutes if the time was near. But that meant they had a few minutes. A few precious moments with no scheduled work or ceremony. "Warden Nimi," Yumi said, gathering her courage, "the Festival of Reveals, it is near." 100 days, yes. "And it is a 13th year," Yumi said. "The Hijo will be unusually active. We will not petition them that day, I assume." "I suppose we won't, Chosen," Liyun said, checking the little calendar in form of a small book she kept in her pouch. She flipped a few pages. "And we'll be near Torio City. We've been traveling in the region." "And I..." Yumi bit her lip. "Ah," Liyun said. "You'd like to spend the festival day in prayer of thanks to the spirits for granting you such an elevated station." "Just say it," a part of Yumi whispered. "Just say no, that's not what you want. Tell her." Liyun snapped her book closed, watching Yumi. "Surely," she said, "that is what you want. You wouldn't actively desire to do something that would embarrass your station, to imply you regret your place, would you, Chosen?" "Never," Yumi whispered. "You were honored," Liyun said, "of all the children born that year to be given this calling, these powers. one of only 14 currently living. I know. You are special. Yumi would have preferred to be less special, but she felt guilty the moment she thought it. Why would she second-guess the spirits? I understand, Yumi said. Lead me to the arena. I am ready to call the spirits today. Chapter 3. The most terrifying thing about nightmares is how they transform. I'm talking about regular nightmares now, not the kind that get painted. Terror dreams, they change. They evolve. It's bad enough to encounter something frightening in the waking world, but at least those mortal horrors have shape, substance. That which has shape can be understood. That which has mass can be destroyed. Nightmares, instead, are a fluid terror. Once you get the briefest handle on one, it'll change. It fills the nooks of the soul like spilled water filling cracks in the floor. Nightmares are a seeping chill, created by the mind to punish itself. A nightmare is the very definition of masochism. Most of us are modest enough to keep that sort of thing tucked away, hidden. But on Painter's world, those dark bits were strikingly prone to coming alive. He stood at the edge of the city, bathed from behind in radioactive teal and electric magenta, and looked out at the darkness. Stiff, like a reflective surface, the shroud shifted and flowed like molten tar. The shroud, the blackness beyond, nightmares unformed. There were trains that traveled the Heian lines to other distant cities. His parents lived in one, less than a day's travel from the larger metropolis of Kilahito, where he'd come to take work. So he knew other cities existed, that this one wasn't alone. Yet it was difficult not to feel isolated while looking into that endless blackness. It stayed away from Heian lines, mostly. He turned to the right and walked along the perimeter for a short time, passing the outer buildings of the city, built in a line like a shield wall with narrow alleyways between. But it was made of buildings and wasn't an actual wall. Walls didn't stop nightmares, so a solid fortification would merely prevent people from stepping out to the perimeter. In Painter's experience, nobody came out here but his kind. The regular people stayed inside. Even just one street inward felt infinitely more safe to them. They lived as he had in his youth, trying so very hard not to think about what was out there, seething, churning, watching. Now, it was his job to confront it. He didn't see anything at first, no signs of particularly brave nightmares encroaching upon the city. The signs could be subtle, however, so he kept walking on the perimeter. His assigned beat was a small wedge of the city, moving inward several blocks, but the outside portion was the widest and most likely to show a sign of a nightmare. As he walked the road outside the city, he continued to imagine that he was some lone warrior doing his rounds, instead of essentially a pest exterminator who had gone to art school. On his right, in toward the city, he began passing the capstone paintings. He wasn't certain where the local painters had gotten the idea, but these days, during dull moments on patrol, the painters tended to do some practice work on the outer buildings of the city. The walls facing the shroud naturally didn't have windows, so they made for large, inviting canvases. Not strictly part of the job, these paintings couldn't be turned in as proof of work done. Each was a certain personal statement. He passed Akane's painting, depicting an expansive flower, black paint on the whitewashed wall. His own was 2 buildings over, just a blank white wall, though if you looked closely, you could see the failed project beneath peeking through. He'd need to whitewash it again to make sure that wasn't visible. But not tonight, because finally, he caught signs of a nightmare. He stepped closer to the shroud, but didn't touch it, of course. Yes, the black surface was disturbed, like paint that had been touched when near to drying. It was upset, rippling. It was difficult to make out, as the shroud didn't reflect light, like the ink or tar it otherwise appeared to be. But Painter had trained well. Something had left the darkness here and started in toward the city. He got his brush from his large painter's bag, a tool as long as a sword. He always felt better with it in hand. Then he shifted his bag to his back, feeling the weight of the canvases and ink jar inside. Then he struck inward, passing the whitewashed wall that hadn't quite covered up his old painting. He'd tried 4 times so far. This last one had gotten further than most of his attempts, a painting of the star. He'd started once he'd heard the news of an upcoming voyage intended to travel the darkness of the sky, a trip to the star itself taken by scientists, using a special vessel and a Heian line launched to a place incredibly distant. Because contrary to what everyone assumed, the star wasn't just a spot of light in the sky. Telescopes revealed that it was a planet, occupied, according to their best guesses, by some other people, a place whose light somehow cut through the shroud. The news of the impending trip had briefly inspired him, but he'd lost that spark, and the painting languished. How long had it been since she'd covered it over? A month, at least. On the corner of the wall near the painting, he picked out steaming blackness. The nightmare had passed this way, and had brushed the stones here, leaving residue. It evaporated slowly, shedding black tendrils into the night. He'd expected it to take this path, of course. They almost always took the most direct way into the city, but it was good to confirm. Painter crept back inward, re-entering the realm of Heon light and its twin colors. Laughter echoed from somewhere down to his right. But the nightmare probably hadn't gone that direction. The Pleasure District was where people went to do anything other than sleep. There, he thought, picking out some black wisps on a planter up ahead. The shrub grew toward the Heon lines, the planet's source of raw, nourishing light. So as Painter moved down the empty roadway, he walked through plants and boxes that looked as if they were reaching arms up in silent salute. The next sign came near an alleyway. On the ground this time, an actual footprint. The nightmare had begun evolving, picking up on human thoughts, changing from formless blackness to something with a shape. Only a vague one at first, but instead of a slinking, flowing black thing, it probably had feet now. They rarely left footprints even in this kind of shape, though, so he is fortunate to have found one. He moved into a darker street, where the Heon lines were fine and thin as they flowed overhead. In this shadowy place, he remembered his first nights doing this alone. Despite extensive training, despite mentorship with 3 different painters, he'd felt exposed and raw trying it on his own, like a fresh scrape exposed to the air. His motions, his fear, close to the surface. That fear was layered well beneath the calluses of experience now. Still, he gripped his shoulder bag tightly in one hand and held his brush out like a sword as he crept along. There on the wall was a handprint, with 2 long fingers, and what looked like claws. Yes, it was taking a form. Its prey must be close. Further down the tight alley, pressed between 2 buildings like hands pushing to trap him, he found it. Near a bare wall, a thing of ink and shadow some 7 feet tall. It had formed 2 long arms that bent too many times, the elongated fingers pressed against either side of the stone wall, and its head had sunk through the stone to look into the room inside. The tall ones always unnerved him, particularly when they had long fingers. He felt like he'd seen such things in his own fragmented dreams, figments of terrors buried deep inside that only surfaced when he saw one like this. His feet scraped the stones, and the thing heard, withdrawing its head, wisps of formless blackness rising from it, as if it were ash from a fire still smoldering. No face, though. They never had faces, at least not unless something was going wrong. Instead, these just displayed a deeper blackness on the front of the head, one that dripped dark liquid like tears, as if the head were wax that had been melted from being too close to a fire. Painter immediately put up on his protections, thinking calm thoughts. This was the first and most important training. The nightmares, like many predators that fed on minds, could sense emotions and thoughts. They searched for the most powerful, raw ones to feed upon. So in this case, a placid mind was not of much interest. The thing turned and looked back through the wall. This building had no windows, which was foolish. In removing them, the occupants trapped themselves more fully into the boxes of their homes. Nightmares, though, paid little attention to walls. This one had stretched through the stone. All people did by giving up windows was indulge their own claustrophobia and perhaps make the jobs of painters more difficult. Painter moved carefully, slowly, taking a canvas, a good 3 feet by 3 feet piece of thick cloth in a frame, from his shoulder bag. He sat it on the ground in front of him. His jar of paint followed, black and runny, blank ink, a blend designed to give excellent gradations in the gray and black. For nuance, not that Painter himself bothered with much these days. He dipped the brush in the ink and knelt above his canvas, then hesitated, looking at the nightmare. The blackness continued to stream off of it, but its shape was still fairly indistinct. This was probably only its first or second trip into the city. It took a good dozen trips before a nightmare had enough substance to be dangerous, and they had to return to the shroud each time to renew, lest they evaporate away. So by the looks of it, this one was fairly new. It probably couldn't hurt him. Probably. And here was the crux of why painters were so important, yet so disposable all at once. Their job was essential, but not urgent. As long as a nightmare was discovered and dealt with upon its first 10 or so trips into the city, it could be neutralized. That almost always happened. Painter was good at controlling his fear with thoughts like these. Another part of his training, very pragmatic. Painter tried to consider what it looked like, what its shape could have been. Supposedly, if you picked something that sparked your imagination, you'd have more power over the entity. But he had trouble with this. Rather, during the last few months, it had seemed like more trouble than it was worth. So today, he just settled on the shape of a small bamboo thicket and began painting. The thing had spindly arms, after all. Those are kind of like bamboo. He'd practiced a great number of bamboo stalks. In fact, you could say the painter had a certain scientific precision in the way he drew each segment. A little sideways flourish at the start, followed by a single long line. Then you let the brush linger for a moment, so when you pulled back, the blot you left formed the end knob of the segment of bamboo. You could create each efficiently in a single stroke. It was efficient, and these days that seemed of most importance to him. As he painted, he fixed the shape in his mind, a central, powerful image. And as usual, he drew the thing's attention with such deliberate thought. It hesitated, then pulled its head back out of the wall, turning toward him, face dripping its own ink. It moved toward him, walking on its arms, but those had grown more round, with knobbed segments. Painter continued, stroke, flourish, leaves made by quick flips of the brush, blacker than the main body of the bamboo. Similar protrusions appeared on the arms of the thing as it drew closer. It also shrank upon itself as he painted a pod at the bottom. As always, the image captured the thing, diverted it, so that, by the time it reached him, the transformation was fully in effect. He never lost himself in the painting these days. After all, he told himself, he had a job to do, and he did that job well. As he finished, the thing even adopted some of the sounds of bamboo, the soft rattle of stalks beating against one another, to accompany the omnipresent buzz of the hyaline lines above. He sat back, leaving a perfect bamboo painting on his canvas, mimicked by the thing in the alleyway, leaves rustling softly and brushing the sides of the walls. Then, with a sound much like a sigh, it dispersed. Trapped as it was, it couldn't flee back to the outskirts of the city and rejoin the shroud to regain its strength. Instead, like water trapped on a hot plate, it just evaporated. Soon Painter was alone in the alleyway. He picked up his things, sliding the canvas into the large bag with 3 other unused ones, then went back on patrol. Chapter 4. It took longer than expected for the steam well to erupt, so eventually Leon and Yumi went on their way to the place of ritual. This meant they were crossing near the center of the village when the steam well finally decided to do its job. A glorious jet of water ascended from the hole in the center of the village, a furious, superheated cascade which reached 40 feet at its highest, a gift from the spirits deep below. That was a decent height for this region. The homes were built a good distance back, of course, in a ring around the steam well. Like oh so many things in life, you wanted to be close, but not too close. Steam wells were life in this land, so long as you didn't fraternize. The water, the part that didn't escape as steam, rained down on large bronze trays, set up in 6 concentric rings around the geyser. Elevated from the ground to keep them cool, the metal funneled the water down the slope toward the nearby homes. There were some 60 of those in the town, with room to grow, judging by how much water the steam well erupted. You needed that water to thrive in the land. Rain was rare, and rivers, well, one can imagine what superheated ground did to prospective rivers. Water wasn't rare in Yumi's land, but it was concentrated, centralized, elevated. The air near the steam wells was humid, nourishing migratory plants and other lively entities. You often found clouds above the steam wells, offering shade and occasional rainfall. Further out from the city, though, were the searing barrens, wastelands where the ground was too hot, even for floating plants. The stone here could set clogs of fire and kill travelers who lingered. In Torio, you traveled only at night, and only upon hovering wagons, pulled by flying devices created by the spirits. Needless to say, most people stayed home. The loud pelting of drops against metal basins drowned out the murmurs of the watching crowd. For now, Yumi could be seen. Bathing finished, prayers proffered, her attendants followed with fronds lowered, the ritual sign that the gathered townspeople were allowed to gawk at her. She kept her eyes lowered, and she walked with a practice step. A yokihijo must glide as if a spirit herself. She was glad for the sound of the steam well, for though she didn't mind the whispers and murmurs of awe, they did sometimes overwhelm. She quickly reminded herself that the people's awe wasn't for her, but for her calling. She needed to remember that, needed to banish pride and remain reserved. She most certainly needed to avoid anything embarrassing, like smiling, out of reverence for her station. The station, in turn, didn't notice, as is the case with many things that people revere. She passed homes, most of which were in 2 tiers, One section built against the ground to benefit from the warmth and heat. Another are built on stilts, with air underneath to keep it cooler. Imagine two large planter boxes built against one another, one elevated 4 feet, the other resting on the ground. Most all of them had a tree or two chained to them. Stocky, only about 8 feet from tips of branches to bottom of their wide webbed roots. Of course, these hovered about 2 feet in the air, riding on the thermals. Lighter plants hovered high in the sky, throwing down variegated shadows. During the daytime, you only found low plants in places like the gardens, where the ground was actually cooler. That, and where humans worked to keep them nearby so they didn't float away or get floated away. Torrio is the only land I've ever visited with tree rustlers. At the far side of the town was the Kimomakan, or as we'll use it in this story, the place of ritual. A village usually had only one, lest the spirits get jealous of one another. A few flowers floated nearby, and when Yumi entered, her passing caused them to eddy and spin in behind her. They immediately shot up high into the sky. The place of ritual was a section of extra hot stone, though not nearly on the level of the Outlands. You'd have found it as hot as walking on sand in the summertime, hot enough to be dangerous, but not in most cases deadly. Here, heat was sacred. The village people gathered outside, their clogs scraping stone, parents lifting children. 3 local spirit scribes settled on tall stools to sing songs that, best I can tell, the spirits don't even notice. I approve of the job nonetheless. Anything to gainfully employ more musicians. It's not that we're unable to do anything else. It's more that if you don't find something productive for us to do, we'll generally start asking questions like, hey, why aren't you worshiping me? Everyone waited at the perimeter of the place of ritual, including the Leon. The song started. A rhythmic chanting, accompanying simple percussion made by wooden sticks on wooden pans. A flute in the background. All of it growing more audible as the steam wheel finished relieving itself and stumbled back off to sleep. Inside the place of ritual was just Yumi, the spirits deep underground, and a whole lot of rocks. The villagers spent months gathering them, setting them out through the city, then deliberating over which ones had the best shapes. You might think that your local pastimes are boring, and the things your parents always forced you to do mind-numbing, but at least you didn't spend your days excited by the prospect of ranking rock shapes. Yumi put on a pair of knee pads, then knelt in the center of the rocks, spreading her skirts, which rippled and rose in the thermals. Normally, you did not want your skin to brush the ground. Here, there was something almost intimate about kneeling. Spirits gathered in warm places, or rather, warmth was a sign they were near. They were unseen as of yet. You had to draw them forth, but they wouldn't come to the beck of just anyone. You needed someone like Yumi. You needed a girl who could call the spirits. There were many ways that worked, but they shared a common theme: creativity. Most self-aware, invested beings, be they called Fae, Sion, or Spirit, responded to this fundamental aspect of human nature in one way or another. Something from nothing, creation. Beauty from raw materials, art. Order from chaos, organization. Or in this case, all 3 at once. Each Yoki-Hijo trained in an ancient and powerful art, a kind of deliberate, wondrous artistry, requiring the full synergy of body and mind. Geological reorganization on the microscale involving gravitational equilibrium. Or in other words, the Yoki-Hijo stacked rocks. Yumi selected one with an interesting shape and carefully balanced it on end. They removed her hands and left it standing, oblong, looking like it should fall. The crowd gasped, though nothing arcane or mystical was on display. This was the result of instinct and practice. She placed a second stone on the first, then 2 on top of that at once, balancing them against one another in a way that looked impossible. The 2 incongruous stones, one leaning out to the right, the other precariously resting on its tip and leaning out to the left, stayed steady as she pulled her hands away. There was a deliberate reverence to the way Yumi moved, positioning the rocks, then seeming to cradle them for a moment, stilling them, like a mother with a sleeping child. Then she'd pull her hands away and leave the rocks as if a breath away from collapse. It wasn't magic, but it certainly was magical. The crowd ate it up. If you think their fascination to be odd, well, I'm not going to disagree. It is a little strange, not just the balancing, but the way her people treated the performances and the creations of the Yoki-Hijo as the greatest possible triumphs of artistry. But then again, there's nothing intrinsically valuable about any kind of art. That's not me complaining or making light. It's one of the most wonderful aspects of art. The fact that people get to decide what is beautiful. We don't get to decide what is food and what is not. Yes, exceptions exist. Don't be pedantic. When you pass those marvels, we're all going to laugh at you. But we absolutely get to decide what counts as art. If Yumi's people wanted to declare that arranging rocks surpassed painting or sculpture as an artistic endeavor, well, I personally found it fascinating. And the spirits agreed. Today, Yumi created a spiral using an artist's sequence of progression as a kind of loose structure. You might know it by a different name. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 24. Then back down. The piles of 20 or 30 rocks should have been the most impressive thing about her arrangement. And indeed, the fact that she could stack them so well is incredible. But she found ways to make the stacks of 5 or 3 delight just as much. Incongruous mixes of tiny rocks with enormous ones balanced on top. Shingled patterns of stones, oblong ones hanging out precariously to the sides. Stones as long as her forearm, balanced on their tiniest tips. From the mathematical descriptions, the use of the artist sequence, you might have assumed the progress to be methodical, calculating. And yet somehow, it felt more a feat of organic improvisation than it did one of engineering prowess. Yumi swayed as she stacked, moving to the beats of the drums. She'd close her eyes, swimming her head from side to side as she felt the stones grind beneath her fingers, judged their weights and the way they tipped. Yumi didn't want to just accomplish the task. She didn't want to just perform for the whispering, excitable audience. She wanted to be worthy. She wanted to sense the spirits and know what they wanted of her. They deserved so much better than her. They deserved someone who did more than Yumi's best. Someone who didn't secretly yearn for freedom. Someone who didn't, deep down, reject the incredible gift she'd been given. Over the course of several hours, the sculpture grew into a brilliant spiral of stacks. Yumi outlasted the drumming women, who fell off after about 2 hours. She continued as people took children home for naps or slipped away to eat, and even long enough that Leon had to duck away to use the facilities, then hastily return. Those watching could appreciate the sculpture, of course, but the best view was from above. Or below. Imagine a great swirl made up of stacked stones, evoking the feeling of blowing wind, spiraling, yet made entirely from rock. Order from chaos, beauty from raw materials, something from nothing. The spirits noticed. In record numbers, they noticed. As Yumi continued through scraped fingers and aching muscles, they began to float up from the stones beneath. Teardrop-shaped, radiant like the sun, a swirling orange and blue, the size of a person's head. They'd rise up and settle next to Yumi, watching her progress, transfixed. They didn't have eyes. They were little more than blobs, but they could watch, sense at least. Spirits of this sort find human creations to be fascinating. And here, because of what she'd done, because of who she was, they knew the sculpture was a gift. As the day grew dark and the plants began to drift down from the upper layers of the sky, Yumi finally started to weaken. By now, her fingers were bloodied, the calluses scraped away by repetitive movement. Her arms had changed from sore to numb to somehow both sore and numb. It was time for the next step. She couldn't afford a childish mistake like she suffered in her early years, that of working so hard that she collapsed unconscious before binding the spirits. This wasn't simply about creating the sculpture or providing a pious display. There was a measure of practicality attached to this day's art, like a writer in a contract. Feeling too tired to stand, Yumi turned from her creation, which contained hundreds of stones, the piles at the sides of the yard depleted. Then she blinked, counting the spirits who surrounded her, each in its glory. In this case, looking a little like a series of overly large ice cream scoops that had tumbled from the cone. 37. She'd summoned 37. Most Yoki-Hijo were lucky to get 6. Her previous record had been 20. Yumi wiped the sweat from her brow, then counted again through blurry eyes. She was tired, so lowly tired. "Send forth," she said, voice croaking, "the first supplicant." The crowd agitated with excitement, and the people been running to fetch friends or family members who had fallen off during the hours of sculpting. A strict order of needs was kept in the town, adjudicated by methods Yumi didn't know. Supplicants were arranged, with the lucky 5 or 6 at the top all but guaranteed a spot. Those lower down would usually have to wait another year or more for another Yoki-Hijo to grant their needs. As spirits usually remained bound for 5 to 10 years, with their effectiveness waning in the latter part of that, there is always a grand need for the efforts of the Yoki-Hijo. Today, for example, there were 23 names on the list, even though they'd expected half a dozen spirits to arrive. As one might imagine, there had been a fervor among the members of the town council to fill out the remaining names. Yumi was unaware of this. She simply positioned herself at the front of the arena, kneeling, head bowed, and trying her best not to collapse sideways to the stone. Li Yun allowed the first supplicant in, a man with a head that sat a little too far forward on his neck, like a picture that had been cut in half, then sloppily taped back together. "Blessed bringer of spirits," he said, wringing his cap in his hands. "We need light for my home. It has been 6 years, and we have been without." 6 years? Without a light at nights? Suddenly, Yumi felt even more selfish for her attempt to escape her duties. "I'm sorry," she whispered back, "for failing you and your family these many years." "You didn't." The man cut himself off. It wasn't proper to contradict a Yokihijo, even in trying to compliment them. Yumi turned to the first of the spirits, who inched up beside her, curious. "Light," she said, "please." "Light," she said. "Please, in exchange for this gift of mine, will you give us light?" At the same time, she projected the proper idea of a flaming sun becoming a small glowing orb, capable of being carried into the palm of your hand. "Light," the spirit said to her. "Yes." The man waited anxiously as the spirit shivered, then divided in half, one side glowing brightly with a friendly orange color, the other becoming a dull blue sphere. So dark, it could be mistaken for black, particularly at dusk. Yumi handed the man the 2 balls, one fitting in the palm of each hand. He bowed and retreated. The next requested a repelling pair, like was used in the small garden veranda, to lift her small dairy into the air and keep it cooler to let her make butter. Yumi complied, speaking to the next spirit in line, coaxing it to split into the shape of 2 squat statues with grimacing features. Each supplicant in turn got their request fulfilled. It had been years since Yumi had accidentally confused or frightened off a spirit, though these people didn't know it, and so each waited in worried anticipation, fearing that their request would be the one where the spirit turned away. It didn't happen, though each request took longer to fulfill, longer to persuade, as the spirits grew more detached from her performance. And each request took a little something from Yumi, something that recovered over time, but in the moment left her feeling empty, like a jar of jelly tea being emptied scoop by scoop. Some wanted light, a few wanted repelling devices. The majority requested flyers, hovering devices about 2 feet across. These could be used to help care for crops during the daytime when they soared high and out of the reach of farmers, and needed to be watched by the village's great crows instead. There were some threats that crows could not manage, and being able to interact with them at height was a huge benefit, so a good fleet of flyers was necessary for most settlements. One could make basically anything out of a spirit, provided it was willing and you could formulate the request properly. To Taurish people, using a spirit for light was as natural and as common as spheres might be to you. You might consider it wasteful of the great cosmic power afforded them, but theirs was a harsh land where ground itself could literally boil water. You'll just have to forgive them for making use of the resources they had. Getting through all 37 spirits was nearly as grueling as the art itself, but by the end, Yumi continued in a daze, barely seeing, barely hearing, mumbling ceremonial phrases by rote and projecting to the spirits with more primal need than crisp images. But eventually, the last supplicant bowed and hurried away with his new spirit saw. Yumi found herself alone before her creation, surrounded by cooling air and floating lilies that were drifting down to her level as the thermals cooled. Done. She was done? Each spirit bound it had reinforced her sculpture, the stones of which would now resist tipping as if they'd been glued in place. As the bond weakened, the stones would eventually start to drop over the years, the powers of the spirits responding in kind. But in general, the more spirits you bound in a session, the longer all of them would last. What she'd done that day was unprecedented. Li Yun approached to congratulate her on the work so well done. She found, however, not a magnificent master of spirits, but an exhausted 19-year-old girl, collapsed unconscious, her hair fanning around her on the stone, and her ceremonial silks trembling in the breeze. Chapter 5. The nightmares had originally come from the sky. Painter had heard the stories. Everyone had. They weren't quite histories, mind you. They were fragments of stories that were likely exaggerations. They were taught in school regardless. Like a man with diarrhea in a sandpaper factory, sometimes all available options are less than ideal. I watched it rain the blood of a dying god, one account read. I crawled through tar that took the faces of the people I had loved. It took them, and their blood became black ink. Those are the words of a poet who, after the event, didn't speak or write for another 30 years. Grandfather spoke of the nightmares, another woman had written years later. He doesn't know why he was spared. He stares at nothing when he speaks of those days spent crawling in the darkness, that terror from the sky, until he found another voice. They met and huddled, weeping together, clinging to one another. Though they had never met before that day, they were suddenly brothers, because they were real. And then this one, which I find most unnerving of them all. It will take me. It creeps under the barrier. It knows I am here. That one was found painted on the wall of a cave, roughly 100 years later. No bones were ever located. Yes, the records are sparse, fragmentary, and feverish. You'll need to forgive the people who left them. They were busy surviving an all-out societal collapse. By Painter's time, it had been 17 centuries, and so far as they were concerned, the blackness of the shroud was normal. But they'd only survived because of the Heion, the lights that drove back the shroud, the energy by which a new society could be forged, or in the parlance of the locals, painted anew. But this new world required dealing with the nightmares one way or another. Another bamboo, Tsukishi said, sliding the top canvas from Painter's bag. Bamboo works, Painter said. Why change it if it works? It's lazy, Tsukishi said. Painter shrugged. His shift finished, it was time to turn in his paintings at the foreman's office. The small room was lit by a hanging chandelier. If you touch opposite lines of Heion to each other in a small piece of metal, you can make it heat up. From there, you were just a little sideways skip away from the incandescent bulb. As I said, not everything in the city was teal or magenta. Tsukishi marked a tally by Painter on the ledger. There wasn't a strict quota. Everyone knew that encountering nightmares was random, and there were more than enough painters. On average, you'd find one nightmare a night, but sometimes you went days without even seeing one. They still kept track. Go too long without a painting to turn in, and questions would be asked. Now, the more lazy among you might notice a hole in this system. In theory, the rigorous training to become a painter was supposed to weed out the sort of person who would just paint random things without actually encountering any nightmares. But there was a reason Tsukishi hesitated and narrowed his eyes at Painter after looking at the second canvas and revealing a second bamboo painting. Bamboo works, Painter repeated. You need to look at the shape of the nightmare, Tsukishi said. You need to match your drawing to that, changing the natural form of the nightmare into something innocent, non-threatening. You should only be drawing bamboo if things look like bamboo. They did. Tsukishi glared at him, and the old man had an impressive glare. Some facial expressions, like miso, require aging to hit their potency. Painter feigned indifference, taking his wages for the day and stepping back out onto the street. He slung his bag over his shoulder with his tools and remaining canvases and went searching for some dinner. The Noodle Pupil was a sort of corner restaurant where you could make noise. A place where you weren't afraid to slurp as you sucked down your dinner. Where your table's laughter wasn't embarrassing because it mixed like paint with that coming from the next table over. Though less busy on the night shift than during the day, it was still somehow loud even when it was quiet. Painter hovered around the place like a mote of dust in the light, looking for a place to land. The younger painters from his class congregated here, with the sort of frequency that earned them their own unspoken booths or tables. A double line of Heion outlined the broad window on the front, glowing, made it look like a futuristic screen. Those same lines rose like vines around the window, spelling out the name in teal and magenta, with a giant bowl of noodles on top. Technically, I was part owner in that noodle shop. What renowned interdimensional storytellers can invest in a little real estate now and then? Painter stood outside, absorbing the laughter, like a tree soaking up the light of the Heion. Eventually, he lowered his head and ducked inside, looping his large shoulder bag on one of the prongs of the coat rack without looking. 15 other painters occupied the place, congregating around 3 tables. Akane's table was in the back, where she was adjusting her hair. Tojin knelt low beside the table, solemnly adjudicating a noodle-eating contest between 2 other young men. Painter sat down at the bar. He was, after all, a solitary defense against the miasma outside the city, a lone warrior. He preferred to eat alone, obviously. He wouldn't even have stopped in, save for his tragic mortality. Even solemn, edgy warriors against darkness needed noodles now and then. The restaurant's keeper flitted over behind the bar, then folded her arms and kind of hunched over as she stood, mimicking his pose. Finally, he looked up. Hey, design, he said. Can I have the usual? Your usual is so usual, she said. Don't you want to know a secret? I'll wrap it up and put it in your noodles if you order something new. But I'll also tell you, because the paper will get soggy if it's in the noodles too long, and you won't be able to read it anyway. Painter said. The usual, please. Politeness, she said, pointing at him. Accepted. She did not do a good job of acting human. I take no blame, as she's repeatedly refused my counsel on the matter. At least, her disguise was holding up. People did wonder why the strange noodle shop woman had long white hair, despite appearing to be in her young 20s. She wore tight dresses, and many of the painters had crushes on her. She insisted, you see, that I make her disguise particularly striking. Or well, I should say it in her words. Make me pretty so they'll be extra disturbed if my face ever unravels. And give me voluptuous curves because they remind me of a graphed cosine, and also because boobs look fun. It wasn't an actual body. Everyone kind of learned their lesson on that. But rather, it was a complicated wireframe light weaving, with force projections attached directly to her cognitive element as it manifested in the physical realm. But as I was getting pretty good at the technical side of this, you can pretend it functioned the same as flesh and blood. Now that Painter was here, I was able to see and was particularly proud of the way Painter's eyes followed Design as she walked over and began preparing his meal. His eyes lingered over her the entire time she worked. Don't judge him too harshly. He was 19, and I'm a uniquely talented artist. Design soon returned with his bowl of noodles, which she sat into a circular nook carved into the wood. The heon lines, one connected to either end of the bar, ran heat through the element at the bottom of the bowl to keep the broth warm on chill Kilahito nights. From behind, laughter and chanting heated up as the noodle competition progressed. Painter, in turn, broke his mapon sticks apart and ate slowly, in a dignified way, befitting one of his imaginary station. Design, he said, trying not to slurp too loud, is what I'm doing important? Of course it is, she said, lounging down across the bar from him. If you all didn't eat the noodles, I think I'd run out of places to store them. No, he said, waving to his bag, still hanging from one of the arms of the restaurant's curiously shaped coat rack. I mean, being a nightmare painter, it's an important job, right? Yeah, Design said. Obviously. Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a place with no nightmare painters. Then the people got eaten. It's a short story. I mean, it's important in general. I know it's important in general, Painter said. But is what I'm doing important? Design leaned forward across the bar, and he met her eyes, which was difficult for him considering her current posture. That said, if you have the option, I don't know that you should meet a cryptic's gaze. Their features, when undisguised, bend space and time, and have been known to lead to acute bouts of madness and those who try to make sense of them. Then again, who hasn't wanted to flip off linear continuity now and then, eh? I see what you're saying, she said to him. You do? He asked. Yes. Noodles 7% off tonight, in respect for your brave painting services. It wasn't what he'd been talking about, but he nodded in thanks anyway, because he was a person working a vitally important, yet relatively low-paying job. 7% was 7%. Design, it should be noted, only gave discounts in prime number increments, because, and I quote, I have standards. Still not sure what she meant. She turned to see to another customer, so Painter continued slurping down the long noodles and warm, savory broth. The dish was quite good. Best in the city, according to some people, which isn't that surprising. If there's one thing you can count on a cryptic to do, it's follow a list of instructions with exacting precision. Design had little vials of seasoning she added to the broth, each one counted to the exact number of grains of salt. Halfway through the meal, he looked to the side as Akane stepped up to the bar to get some drinks. He looked away. She was gone a moment later, carrying cans of something festive to the others. He ate the rest of the noodles in silence. Finally, Design noticed he was almost done. Rice? She asked. Yes, please. She added a scoop to soak up the rest of the broth, and he ate it down. You could go talk to them, Design said softly, wiping at the counter with a rag. I tried that in school. It didn't go well. People grow up. It's one of the things that makes them different from rocks. You should. I'm fine, he said. I'm a loner, Design. You think I care what others think of me? She cocked her head, squinting with one eye. Is that a trick question? Because you obviously... How much? He said, with the discount. She sighed. 6. 6? A bowl usually costs 200 kon. 97% off, she said. Because you need it, Painter. You sure about this? I could go talk to them, tell them that you're lonely. Why don't I go do it right now? He laid a 10 kon coin on the counter with a quick bow of thanks. Then, before she could push him further to do something that was probably good for him, he grabbed his bag from among the others hanging on the rack. He'd always found the statue coat rack a strange addition to the restaurant, but it was a quirky place. So why not have a coat rack in the shape of a man with hockey's features and a sly smile? I had screamed inside when Design, thinking me too creepy otherwise, had spray painted me copper And, ever practical, she'd added a crown and several large bandoliers with poles on them for holding more bags or coats. What? I said I owned the restaurant, part at least, and I did, since she had ransacked my pockets for the money to build the place. I didn't run it, though. You can't do that when you've been frozen in time. For your information, I have it on good authority that I made an excellent coat rack. I prefer not to think of it as an undignified disposal of my person, but rather me pulling off an incredible disguise. Painter stepped outside, heart thumping. A faint mist in the air gave the street a reflective sheen. An empty passage, lights hanging above, and then seeming to coat the ground below. He breathed in and out and in again. And there, having fled from design's offers, he found it hard to maintain the fabrication. He wasn't a loner. He wasn't some proud knight fighting the darkness for honor. He wasn't important, interesting, or even personable. He was just one of likely thousands of unremarkable boys without the courage to do anything notable, and worse, without the skill to go underappreciated. It was an unfair assessment of himself, but he thought it anyway and found it difficult to stomach. Difficult enough that he wanted to retreat back toward his easy lies of self-imposed solitude and noble sacrifice. Unfortunately, another part was beginning to find those attitudes silly, cringeworthy. With a sigh, he started off toward his apartment, his large painter's bag across his shoulder and resting against his back. At the first intersection, though, he spotted a telltale sign. Wisps of darkness curling off the stone at the corner. A nightmare had passed this way recently. That wasn't too surprising. They were still in the poorer section of town near the perimeter. Nightmares passed this way with some regularity. Another painter would find this one eventually. He was off shift. Hands in pockets, absorbed by his personal discontent, he walked past the corner. If he hurried home, he could still catch the opening of his favorite drama that would be broadcast through the Heon viewer. A light rain blew through the city, playing soft percussion on the street, making the reflective lines of light dance to the beat. Those dark wisps began to fade from the corner of the stone, the trail going cold. 2 minutes later, Painter returned, stepping through a puddle and heading on after the nightmare, murmuring to himself that the first part of the drama was always a recap anyway. Chapter 6. Yumi awoke on the floor of her wagon, a blanket over her. The chill air of night had won its daily battle, driving back the deep heat of the stones beneath. She had been bathed, dressed in her formal sleeping gown, and placed here, surrounded by flower petals in a circle, along with a ring of seeds for good luck. Starlight cut around her in a square, reaching through the window to gawk. Sore, still somehow exhausted despite her hours of sleep, Yumi huddled in her blankets. The stone floor was comfortably warm. They lowered the wagon at nights to touch the ground and draw forth its heat. You always wanted a home to touch the stones in some way for warmth at night or for cooking in the day. People on other worlds don't know what they're missing. There's a unique comfort to being able to lay down, drape a blanket over yourself, and bake in the floor's own radiance. It was almost like the planet itself was feeding you life and strength. Yumi huddled there for some time, trying to recover. She knew she should have felt pride at her accomplishment, and virtually any other person would have. But she just felt tired, and guilty because of her lack of proper emotions. And more tired, because guilt of that sort is exceptionally difficult to carry, heavier than the rocks she'd moved earlier. Then ashamed, because guilt has a great number of friends and keeps their addresses handy for quick summoning. Heat seeped up around Yumi, but it didn't seem to be able to enter her. It cooked her, but she remained raw in the middle. She stayed there until the door opened. You might have heard clogged footsteps approaching first, but Yumi hadn't noticed. The figure in the doorway waited. In the deep of night, it was little more than a drop of ink on black paper. Until finally, Yumi looked up, realizing she'd been crying. The tears hit the floor and didn't immediately evaporate. "How did I do today, Leon?" Yumi finally asked. "You did your duty," Leon replied, voice soft, yet rasping, like ripping paper. "I never heard of a Yokihijo summoning 37 spirits in one day before," Yumi said, hopeful. It wasn't her warden's job to compliment her, but it would feel good to hear the words nonetheless. "Yes," Leon said, "it will make people question. Were you always this capable? Were you holding back in other cities, refusing to bless them as you did this one?" "I'm certain it is wisdom in you, chosen," Leon said, "to do as you did. I am certain it is not you working too hard, so that the next town in line gets a much smaller blessing and therefore thinks themselves less worthy also." Yumi felt sick at the very thought. Her arms dangled at her sides because moving them was painful. "I will work hard tomorrow." "I'm sure you will." Leon paused. I would hate to think that I trained a Yokihiju who did not know how to properly pace herself. I would also hate to think that I was such a poor teacher that my student thought it wise to pretend to be unable to reach her full potential in order to have an easier time of her job. Yumi shrank down further, wincing at the throbs of pain from muscles in her arms and back. It seemed that even in great success, she did not do enough. Neither is true, fortunately. I will tell Gongsha Town, Lian said. They can look forward to a visit from a strong Yokihijo tomorrow. Thank you. May I offer a reminder, Chosen? Yumi glanced up, and kneeling where she was, the perspective made Lian seem to be 10 feet tall, a silhouette against the night, like a cutout with blank space in the middle. Yes, Yumi said. Please. You must remember, Lian said, that you are a resource to the land, like the water of the steam well, like the plants, the sunlight, and the spirits themselves. If you do not take care of yourself, you will squander the great position and opportunity you have been given. Thank you, Yumi whispered. Sleep now, if it pleases you, Chosen. It takes real talent to use an honorific as an insult. I'll give Lian that. It's professional courtesy from one hideous bastard to another. Lian shut the door with a click, and Yumi looked down, continuing to kneel. But she didn't go back to sleep. She felt too much. Not just pain, not even just shame. Other rebellious things. Numbness, frustration, even anger. She hauled herself to her feet, walking across the lukewarm stone floor of the wagon to the window. From here, she could see the rice bushes, which had lowered from the sky as the thermals cooled. A starlight collection of hundreds of individual plants, spinning and drifting lazily near the stone, their gas pockets slowly reinflating. One under each of the 4 broad leaves, with a cluster of seeds growing on top. It wasn't actually rice, as people would call it on Scadrial. The local word was mingo, but it boiled up close to the same, except for the deep blue-purple color, so we'll use the familiar word. As Yumi watched, a burst of rice bushes jetted into the air, some dozen plants catching a rogue night thermal. Then they drifted lazily back down, where small creatures scurried underneath, looking for something to nibble on and avoiding serpents. Both prey and hunters slept in trees during the heat. If they were fortunate, or unfortunate depending on the perspective, they picked different trees. A gust across the field made it shiver and sway to the side, but night farmers moved along, waving large fans to keep the crops contained. Somewhere, distant in the town, a giant crow cawed. They aren't as big as everyone says. I've never seen one the size of a full-grown man, more the size of a 7- or 8-year-old. A village corvitor soon hushed the animal with soothing words and a treat. Yumi wished she had someone to comfort her. Instead, she rested aching arms on the windowsill and stared out at the placid crops, turning lazily, occasionally jetting into the air. A tree leashed to the side of the building shivered in the breeze, its branches casting lines of shadows across Yumi's face. She could maybe just crawl out of the window and start walking. No night farmer would stop a Yokihijo. She should have felt ashamed at the thought, but she was full up with shame at the moment. A cup filled to the top can't hold anything more. It just spills out to the sides, then boils on the floor. She wouldn't leave, but that night she wished she could. Wished she could escape the prison of her ceremonial nightgown. She wasn't even allowed to sleep as a normal person. She had to be reminded by her very undergarments what she was. Chosen at birth, blessed at birth, imprisoned at birth. A voice said in her mind, I understand. Yumi started, spinning around. Then she felt it, from deep below. A spirit. Her soul vibrated with its presence, a powerful one. Bound, it said. You are bound. Spirits understood her thoughts. That was part of her blessing. But they very, very rarely responded. She'd only heard of it happening in stories. I am blessed, she thought toward it, bowing her head, suddenly feeling extremely foolish. Had she let her fatigue drive her to such insane thoughts? She'd anger the spirits. Suddenly she had a terrible premonition. The spirits refusing to come at her performances. Villages going without light, without food because of her. How could she reject such a... No, the spirit thought. You are trapped, and we are trapped like you. Yumi frowned, stepping back to the window. Something was different about this voice, this spirit. It seemed so very tired, and it was distant, barely able to reach her. She looked up at the sparkling sky and the bright day star stronger than them all. Was the spirit talking to her from there? You work so hard, the spirit said. Can we give you something, a gift? Yumi's breath caught. She'd read that story. Most cultures have something similar. Some are terrible, but this one wasn't one of those. Here, the boons of the spirits were always associated with wondrous adventure. She didn't want adventure, though. She hesitated, teetered like a stone unbalanced. Then, in what was the most difficult moment of her life, she lowered her eyes. "You have already blessed me," she said, "with the greatest gift a mortal can have. I accept my burden. It is for the best of my people. Forgive my idle thoughts earlier." "Very well," the distant spirit said. "Then could you give us a boon?" Yumi looked up. That never happened in the stories. "How?" she asked. "We are bound, trapped." She glanced toward the corner of the room, where a spirit light, the spheres touching to turn the light off for sleep, lay on a counter. It was identical to the one she'd made earlier today. One light, one dark. Trapped? No, the spirit thought. That is not our prison. We have a more terrible existence. Can you free us? Will you try? There is one who can help. Spirits in trouble? She didn't know what she could do, but it was her duty to see them cared for. Her life was to serve. She was the Yoki-Hijo, the girl of commanding primal spirits. "Yes," she said, bowing her head again. "Tell me what you need, and I will do whatever I can." "Please," it said, "free us." All went black. Chapter 7. Painter wound through the next set of streets, tracking the nightmare as the rain tapped him on the head. The trail was difficult to follow. The dark wisps seemed to vanish in the haze of the rain. He had to backtrack twice as the streets grew more narrow, more winding, around through the huddled tenements of the city's outer ring. Deep in here, the hewn lines overhead were thin as twine, barely giving him enough light to see by. It got so bad that eventually he decided he'd likely lost the trail. He turned to return home, passing a slit of a window he'd neglected to glance through just earlier. He checked it this time, and found the nightmare inside, crouching at the head of a bed. The room was lit by a faint line of teal heon tracing the ceiling, making shadows of the room's meager furniture and frameless mattress, which held 3 figures. Parents that the nightmare had ignored, and a child who made for more tender prey. The little boy was perhaps 4. He huddled on his side, eyes squeezed shut, holding a worn pillow that had eyes sewn on it, a poorer family's approximation of a stuffed toy. The use indicated it was loved anyway. The nightmare was tall enough that it had to bend over, or its head would have hit the ceiling. A sinuous, boneless neck, a body with a lupine set of features, legs that bent the wrong way, a face with a snout. With a sense of dread, Painter realized why this one had been so difficult to track. Virtually no smoke rose from its body. Most telling, it had eyes. Bone white, like drawn in chalk, but deep, like holes going down into the skull. This barely dripped darkness from its face. It was almost fully stable, no longer formless, no longer aimless, no longer harmless. This thing must have been incredibly crafty to have escaped notice this long. It took 10 feedings or more for a nightmare to coalesce to this level. Only a few more, and it would be fully solid. Painter stepped backward, trembling. It already had substance. Things like this, they could slaughter hundreds. Things like this had destroyed entire towns in the past. Most recently, the one known as Fudinoro, destroyed only 30 years back. This was above his pay grade, quite literally. There was an entire specialized division of painters tasked with stopping stable nightmares. These traveled the land, going to towns where stable nightmares had been spotted. The sound of a small sniffle broke through Painter's panic. He ripped his eyes from the nightmare to look back at the bed, to where the child, trembling, had squeezed his eyes closed even tighter. The child was awake. At this stage, the nightmare could feed on direct terror just as easily as it did the formless fear of a dream. It ran clawed fingers across the child's cheek, leaving streaks of blood on the skin. The gesture was almost tender, and why shouldn't it be? The child had given the thing shape and substance, ripped directly out of its deepest fears. Now, the story thus far might have given you an unflattering picture of Painter. And yes, much of that picture is probably justified. Many of his problems in life were his own fault, and rather than try to fix them, he alternated between comfortable self-delusion and pointless self-pity. But you should also know that right then, before the nightmare saw him, he could easily have slipped away into the night. He could have reported this to his foreman, who would have sent for the dream watch. Most painters would have done just that. Instead, he reached for his painting supplies. Too much noise, he thought as he slapped his bag down on the pavement and scrambled for a canvas. Lessons he didn't realize he'd internalized returned to him. He couldn't wake the people in the room. If the parents started screaming, the stable nightmare would attack and people would die. Calm, calm, don't feed it. His training barely held as he, trembling, spilled out canvas, brush, and paints. He looked up and found the thing at the window, long net stretching out toward him, knife fingers scraping the wall inside the room. 2 wide eye holes seemed to want to suck him into them, pull him through to some other eternity. Before this day, he'd never seen a nightmare with anything resembling a face. This one smiled with bone-white, lupine teeth. Painter's fingers slipped on the ink jar, and it hit the ground before him with a clink, spraying ink on the ground. He struggled to keep his calm as he fumbled for it, then frantically dipped his brush right into the spilled ink. The nightmare stretched forward, but then caught. It wasn't used to having so much substance, and had trouble pulling itself through the wall. The claws were particularly difficult. The delay, though brief, probably saved Painter's life, as he managed to get his umbrella out and opened to shelter his canvas, then started painting. He started with bamboo, of course. A blob at the bottom, then the straight line upward with the swipe. Just the briefest linger to make the next knob like clockwork. He'd done this 100 times. He looked to the nightmare, which slowly slid one hand out through the wall, leaving gouges in the stone. Its smile deepened. Painter, at his current state, was most certainly not invisible to it, and bamboo was not going to be enough this time. Painter tossed aside his canvas and pulled the last one from his bag. Nails ground on stone as the thing pulled its second hand through the wall. Rainwater actually connected with its head, running down the sides of its grinning face, crystal tears to accompany the few midnight ones. Painter began painting. There's a certain insanity that defines artists, the willful ability to ignore what exists. Millennia of evolution have produced in us not just the ability to recognize and register light, but to define colors, shapes, objects. I don't think we often acknowledge how amazing it is that we can tell something what something is just by letting some photons bounce off of us. An artist can't see this. An artist has to be able to look at a rock and say, that's not a stone, that's a head. At least it will be once I pound on it with his hammer for a while. Painter couldn't just see a nightmare. He had to see what it could be, what it might have been, if it hadn't been produced by terror. And in that moment, he saw the child's mother. Though he barely had glimpsed her face in the bedroom next to her son, he recreated her. Turned something terrible into something normal, something loved. Even with a few brief strokes, he evoked the shape of her face, stark eyebrows, thin lips, faint brushes of ink, the curve of cheeks. For the briefest moment, something returned to him, something he'd lost in the monotony of 100 paintings of bamboo, something beautiful. Or, if you were a nearly stabilized nightmare, something terrible. It fled. An event so incongruous that Painter slipped in his next brushstroke. He looked up and barely caught sight of the thing running down the alleyway away from him. It could have attacked, but it wasn't quite stable yet, and so it chose to flee, rather than to risk letting him bind it into a passive, harmless shape. He breathed out and let the paintbrush slip from his fingers. He was relieved on one hand, worried on the other. If it could escape like that, it was dangerous, extremely dangerous. He had basically no idea how to deal with something like that, and doubted his skill could have been enough to defeat it. Only the most skilled painters could actually bring down a stable nightmare, and he'd learned, painfully, that wasn't him. But fortunately, he didn't have to do anything more. He'd done enough to frighten it away. It would return to the shroud now to recover, and he could go tell his superiors about the experience. They'd send for the Dream Watch. They could hunt it before it finished its last 2 feedings, and the city would be safe. He left the canvas on the ground beside the umbrella and stepped up to the wall, wrapping his arms around himself to try to get some warmth to run through him again. Inside the room, the child had opened his eyes and was staring at him. Painter smiled and nodded. The kid immediately started screaming. That was more violent a reaction than Painter had been expecting, but it had the desired result. A pair of terrified parents comforting the boy, followed by a hesitant father in shorts opening the tiny window. He regarded the supplies on the ground, paintings slowly losing their ink to the rain, and the wet young man standing in the alleyway. Painter? He asked. Was it? A nightmare, Painter said, feeling numb. A strong one, feeding off of your son's dream. The man backed away from the window, eyes wide. He searched the room, as if to find something hiding in the corners. I frightened it away, Painter said. But this was a strong one. Do you have family in another city? My parents, the man said. In Fuhima. Go there, Painter said, speaking words he'd been taught to say in such a situation. Nightmares can't track a person that far. Your son will be safe until we can deal with the horror. There is a fund available to help you during this time. Once I register what happened, you'll be able to access it. The man looked back at the child, huddled in his mother's arms, weeping. Then the man looked at Painter, who knew what would come next. Demands, asking why he'd let the thing escape. Why he hadn't been strong enough, good enough, practiced enough to actually capture the thing. Instead, the man dropped to his knees, bowing his head. Thank you, he whispered. He looked back up at Painter, tears in his eyes. Thank you. Huh. Painter blinked, stammering a second. Then he found his words. Think nothing of it, citizen, he said. Just a man doing his job. Then, with as much decorum as he could manage in the rain, and with hands that were still trembling from the stress, he gathered up his things. By the time he finished, the family was already packing their meager possessions. You'd forgive Painter for walking a little swiftly, often checking over his shoulder as he wound back through the narrows of the outer ring. He had the feeling of one who'd just been in a crash between two vehicles, or one who had nearly been crushed by a falling piece of stone dropped from a construction site. A part of him couldn't believe he was still alive. He breathed a sigh of relief as he stepped back out onto the larger road and saw people moving through it. People up for morning shift, heading to jobs. The star was low in the sky, just barely visible over the horizon, down hanging right at the end of the street. He looked toward the foreman's offices. But suddenly, Painter found himself unnaturally tired. His feet like clay, mushy, his head like a boulder. He teetered. He needed sleep. The nightmare would not return to the city tonight. It would run to the shroud, regenerate, then sleep again the following night. He could tell the foreman in the morning. Sluggishly, mind a haze, he turned toward his apartment. It was near, fortunately. He barely registered arriving, climbing the stairs and walking to his apartment. It took him 4 tries to get the key in, but as he stumbled into his room, he paused. Dared he sleep? The family needed his report for the funds. What was happening to him? Why did he suddenly feel like he'd been sucked of all strength? He stumbled to the balcony, looking out at the star. Then he heard something odd, a rushing sound, like water. He looked up. Something came from the sky and hit him hard. All went black. Painter blinked. He was hot, uncomfortably hot, and something was shining in his face. A garish light, like from the front of a Heon Line bus. He blinked his eyes open and was immediately blinded by the terrible, overpowering light. What was, lowly, going on? He'd hit his head, perhaps. He forced his eyes open against the light and pulled himself, with effort, to his feet. He was wearing bright cloth. Yes, a silken kind of nightgown, made of bright red and blue cloth. Behind him lay a girl. You'd recognize her as Yumi. She opened her eyes, then screamed. The end of part 1. So, that is Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. Where did this come from? Well, you can probably tell this is another Hoid story. I wanted, after I wrote Secret Project 1, which is in Hoid's voice, I wanted to try a different style of voice for Hoid. That was very much more fairy tale, and I like that. I think it turned out really well. I'm very proud of it. I'll probably use that voice again sometime. But I wanted to try one where Hoid was more in a narrative style, a more traditional narrative style, if that might be said. I wanted him to tell a story that felt less fairy tale and more dramatic. And so I started working on this as kind of an expansion of who he is as a storyteller. And the original idea came from a story I read long ago. My assistant, Peter Ahlstrom, before I hired him to be my assistant, and now he's my editorial director and VP of editorial. Before that, he worked translating manga. He would be the editor who would polish up manga after people translated into English. He would make it into good English, so to speak. And before he got this as his job, he did it on a fan site where he translated and worked on a story called Yokiro no Go. It's about a young man who learns to play Go. I think that's what it is. You'll have to look it up. But I am not a big reader of manga. I do read and experience all kinds of media. I have nothing against it, but it's not really been my jam, so to speak. I have been epic fantasy, but Peter was a good friend and he was working on this, and I wanted to support him in the thing he was working on. And I actually found this story fantastic. I really enjoyed it. It's a story about a young man who finds a possessed Go board where an old master rises from the Go board as a ghost and teaches him to play Go. How did this inspire this? Well, what's happening here, I would read you a bit of the next chapter, and I'm going to give minor spoilers for it, but we didn't get far, is Painter is now going to be seen by everybody as Yumi. Even though he sees himself as himself, he feels his body as his own, he is in her world, and Yumi has gone incorporeal. And he needs to do her job in her world, which that dynamic was really fun to me. This whole idea of you are going to have to be trained basically to use another person's magic system and world while everyone sees you as her. And then if you will forgive a little spoiler, she's going to have to do the reverse, and we'll alternate chapters. And so we have this book where two people have to learn one another's magic systems, be trained by the other person. There's a little bit of body swap going on, but because they see themselves as themselves, I'm not kind of going down that route with the trope. I'm more going down the route of trying to learn and live another person's experience in life. And this was really fun to me. Because it was originally inspired by a manga, I decided to kind of use a little bit of Korean culture, a little bit of Japanese culture mixed in with some other things that I wanted to use to kind of add a dynamic to the two different cultures. That is my primary inspiration for this story. You might see little echoes of Your Name as well in this. That's intentional as well. It is a story that I really, really enjoyed reading. I'm looking forward to getting this to you in the coming months, in the coming years, I guess. It is Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. And I guess there's one other inspiration I need to mention, which is Final Fantasy X, my favorite Final Fantasy. In fact, Yumi's named slightly after Yuna, the main character of that, because the whole idea of fantastical jobs using magic is a big theme in that, and it's something that's long inspired me to look for kind of fantastical yet mundane jobs that people can do in fantasy worlds. So there are my inspirations. All of them, by coincidence, ended up coming from Japan. So that's where you'll see the influences lying in the creation of this, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. Thank you guys, as always, for listening to my random ramblings about these stories, and I will be back next week with the last one, which is very much a different thing from any of the three you've seen before.